experiences?
Well, I had the experience of doing some research in this area myself, and I was very interested in a letter he sent to the U.S. ambassador in India saying that this man Nehru is someone I want you to spend all of your time on, that he's pivotal to the developments that are going to be underway in that country. And then he went out of his way, as you say, in 1956 to invite Nehru to the Gettysburg Farm. I have to say that Nehru was the only one actually to stay in the house. Others would later stay in a guest house, but he was put in the room my sister and I used to share. Oh my. So he got the family treatment, I can tell you. It's a good thing that international relations didn't suffer for it. But,
right. Will, the book you wrote is really, it's really something special. But I wonder if you could set the scene for us a bit. Maybe take us back to 1959 or that period, and what the president was concerned about, both domestically and internationally, and how this trip fit in.
So first of all, I love that video and that speech, because that's really the true Eisenhower. I mean, he was complicated, but then that really was who he was. In many ways, it's in tension with some of the policies of his administration, but that man that you saw there was the true Eisenhower, and by that I mean, what is he really doing in that speech? So that's a speech to an American audience, the staff, the embassy staff, American community in India, and he's deflecting attention to them. He's saying, don't listen to the leaders so much as think about your contribution. That is something he did very well as a military leader. That's something he did in some of his most famous public speeches, especially when he was getting all of these honors at the end of World War II, was to deflect attention and praise back onto the average soldier. It's a wonderful gesture, and it became a sort of habit for him. And I think just as a tool of a lesson of leadership, he was the most famous and arguably the most beloved man in the world in the decade of the 1950s, honestly. And yet he always found a way to say, your work is much more important than what I'm doing. So just bear that in mind. We're all internationalists, we're globalists, we like foreign policy, but we also know, everybody in this room knows, that the president is overwhelmingly concerned with domestic politics. We hate to admit it, but it's overwhelmingly the case. And sometimes the president hates that he is trapped by domestic politics, but this is also true of Eisenhower. In 1958, Eisenhower had a pretty rough year. 1957 was the Sputnik launch. 1958 was the accusations of the missile gap. There was a short recession. And in November of 1958, the Republican Party got absolutely hammered in the midterm elections, absolutely hammered. So coming back in the beginning of 1959, he's facing a totally Democratic-controlled Congress. He's in the lame duck period of his presidency. He's got 2 years left. What's he going to do? What's going to be his great legacy? And he has meetings with his advisors, and his advisors say, you're going to go over the head of Congress and you're going to take the Ike show on the road. You're going to be an ambassador of peace. So what he does is he's planning in 1959 and 1960 to do this. He wants to this extraordinary trip is a result of trying to go to the world with a message of peace. He really wants to travel to the Soviet Union, and that is why he invites Khrushchev to come to the United States in the fall of 1959. Hoping to get a reciprocal trip to the Soviet Union in 1960, which was in fact planned but didn't happen. We can get into that. But so he's engaging with Nehru. He's also earlier, but now it's Khrushchev. Then he's off to the world, and this world trip is 12 countries. Starts in Italy with meeting the Pope, and he goes to Central Asia, then he comes back around North Africa, back to Europe. It's an incredible trip. But he's thinking about how to secure his legacy. And his legacy is going to be a mission of peace to the extent that he has this extraordinary reputation globally as a man of honor, decency, and goodwill. Yeah. So always bear in mind that behind every public appearance on the world stage, there's usually some domestic political trap that that a president's trying to get out of.
That's interesting. I want to focus you on the remarks themselves, because in the Delhi remarks, the president says he's been talking a lot about America's deep desire for peace. And he says, I know the people of the nations around the world feel exactly as the people of America do. And I found this really interesting. He said, I have never yet found a people that were belligerent. I know of no men that just long for the battlefield. Now you could argue that's a really hopeful view of the world, like we're all peaceful and we aspire to peace, which a lot of people don't accept. Or you could say he was so shaped and impacted by the brutality of World War II, or maybe it's both. What's going on there?
I think you've got it right. He knew as the arguably the world's most famous soldier that he could be most powerful by preaching a message of hostility to war, and he did it from the moment the Second World War ended. One of the remarks that he gave when he was getting awards in New York was, you'll find no greater pacifist than the general officer. He hates war. He never wants it. Now, that was in 1945, after this extraordinary conflagration. So he carried that message with him for much of the rest of his life, that nobody wants war, and anyone who's seen it really doesn't want it. Now, mind you, and again, Eisenhower is sometimes in tension with himself, because his administration was extraordinarily focused on building up the deterrent capabilities of the United States, and in the 1950s, the United States spent more on defense as a percentage of GDP than any peacetime administration in American history, period, including up until today, by a mile, 10% of GDP on defense. So it's not as if the United States was beating its swords into plowshares. Quite the opposite. He was saying that's the way we're going to secure peace, through diplomacy, but also being prepared for war if we need it. So a wonderfully, you say he's not complicated, but he appears to be not complicated, but his policies sometimes were actually somewhat complex.
Susan, he goes on to say, but the governments have a habit of getting into the way of the sentiments and feelings of people. It's the governments that conduct propaganda. I won't comment about today's environment, that put out what they call information. And he says it's really the governments that are creating the problems for the people. And it's this recurring theme that if we just let the people engage with each other directly, let the diplomats do their work, get the politicians and the governments out of the way, that's his recipe. And he had such respect for diplomats, for diplomacy, for this conduct of just people-to-people ties. Where does that come from? What's that about?
Well, I think, first of all, it's clearly aspirational. I mean, it might sound actually even naive, but his job, as much as anything else, was to inspire people. And as Will very rightly said, to make them understand that they have responsibilities in this process too. It's very easy to become apathetic or to check out because this is all the government's issue. I would mention one other thing, and it's something that I thought was very powerful, especially with respect to American views about the Soviet Union at the time, but you could fill in the blank with any other country, that Eisenhower was, and this is in quotes, wanted to avoid what he called the potential for paranoid uncertainty, that this was the most dangerous environment of all, and people-to-people contacts would be a way of mitigating the fear we have of other people we don't know. We're seeing signs of it today in our society.
Yeah.
And speaking of paranoid uncertainty, oh my goodness, I mean, we should hold that thought in our heads, because as the countries around the world today retreat into themselves, you can see the potential dangers.
Well, there's what you said is really important, because there's another subtext in the remarks, which for everything in the remarks, even the 2019 reference, the thing that is most, I guess, compelling to me, and I guess I'd ask both of you, he says, like, there's a theme of respect. Right. No matter how someone is dressed, no matter what their language, and then this is his quote, you can show the inborn courtesy that is expected of God's creatures. He's going to treat you with respect regardless of how you look, regardless of what your religion is, regardless of whether you have an accent or not, regardless of whether you're poor or rich. And that's just an incredibly thoughtful view.
I just happened to be at the Eisenhower farm last week, and I commend it to you if you haven't visited it. If you want to get exactly to that notion, go and see Eisenhower's home, where he brought Nehru, where he brought Khrushchev, where he brought Churchill, and you will see that this is a warm, modest family home. And they sat on chairs on the back porch, and they simply talked to one another. Now, it didn't lead to immediate breakthroughs, but it did have an extraordinary personalizing effect. And I think what it reveals is that the guy was not a man who cared about the trappings of power.
You know, I would add to that, Rich, and I think it's very important because you talked about the year 2019 and these group of scouts. Yeah. If you go back and read Ike's speeches, he's always throwing in there his grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't taking it personally. This is a way of talking about rising generations. So he was playing a long game. And I think this is the reason he focused on those young people in the audience and trying to bring some sense of spirit to them as well about the role that they're going to play now and in the future.
Yeah, so this 2019 reference, obviously, I assume it's a random reference. I mean, did it ever come up before?
No, he's 69.
Right, no, I know.
During the visit, so just doing the math.
Right, but he just kind of randomly looks out and sees what he thinks are 9-year-old kids and does this math. But when we think about, again, the themes, just if he was here today, what's the scorecard? Where are we on any of these themes that you mentioned isolationism, you mentioned America's role in the world. What would he say to Republican leaders, Democratic leaders, Americans?
Well, I've got my own theories about this, but he did play for the long game, and he left the budget in balance for his successor with a surplus. He thought that was all part of good stewardship. I think he'd be deeply concerned about the state of our finances. Maybe the economy looks good, but I don't know how $1 trillion budget deficit looks to people here in this audience, but I think that would worry him. Also, think about what the middle way that he espoused represents. It represents the area around which conciliation, compromise can take place, and I think he'd be very disturbed by our unwillingness to find that common ground. What do you think?
I agree, and I think the one message that one could take from this video and these remarks is respect for people with whom you might disagree, especially on the world stage, but that can apply at home. You spoke about the generosity that he talked about, the idea of welcoming the stranger into your house, the idea of saying, let's just talk and exchange some pleasantries, and in that small way, we're going to send out a little ripple of good feeling. I mean, these are gestures that mattered enormously to Eisenhower, I think to his generation. There was a kind of courtliness, a formality, a dignity, but also a simplicity about his bearing. These are things, frankly, my students cannot really literally pick Eisenhower out of a lineup. That's the distance we have traveled from that time. And yet you watch his remarks and you get a sense for his personality and you think, man, there are things we can learn from this man.
Yeah, that's perhaps a good way to end, because he also ends on a hopeful note.
Yeah.
I mean, he says the people to people is what will save the world, and which is exceptionally hopeful note. I just want to ask you both what you're both working on now. Is there a new book coming up for you, and is there another Eisenhower project? Susan, how about you?
Well, I'm finishing How Ike Led as we speak, and it'll be out in May, late May, probably early June.
Great.
I've been working in the Library of Congress this week, going there just again this afternoon, on how Americans responded to the collapse of democracy around the world in the late 1930s. There's a few echoes, I think, to our contemporary period.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being here. Thank you for sharing this history with us, and we really have learned so much from this great leader and your interpretations of his leadership as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So let's see. My job is to transition us quickly into the next discussion, and we're really thrilled to have another leader here. This time from the congressional perspective. Congressman Ami Bera is someone who is a friend to many of us. Not only a great congressman from California, a great Indian American congressman, some incredible roots. He has been a trailblazer, a brave and courageous leader. We are really lucky to have him in the Congress. There are some big and important things in front of him, and he's got some really interesting views about not only the U.S. role in the world, but in the Indo-Pacific specifically. Congressman Bera, thank you so much for being here. Give you a big round of applause. Thank you. Good to see you.
Rich, thanks for that generous introduction. And all I'm trying to do is follow in the footsteps of my former chairman, Congressman Ed Royce, who joined us. And I think Chairman Royce, Chairman Engel demonstrated what's possible in a bipartisan way, that our foreign policy really does have to stop at the water's edge. And I think it is, we're celebrating President Eisenhower's speech, but it was 61 years ago that the first Asian American member of Congress, the Leap Sing Sound, first Indian American member of Congress, made a visit to India in 1958. And I get to take the baton from Congressman Sound and his legacy, but also your grandfather's legacy. And it's an interesting time in the world, but I'm an optimist. And let me reflect back to your grandfather's generation and your grandfather's leadership, President Eisenhower. If we think about what the United States did in the 70 years post-World War II, I don't think we missed the mark. I think we created a more peaceful planet. We lifted millions out of poverty. We ought to be proud about that. The Marshall Plan, rebuilding Japan, stepping up to protect the Korean Peninsula. We lifted these countries, and that was United States leadership. That was United States foreign policy. That was a legacy of your grandfather and his vision. We ought to be proud about that. We find ourselves at a different nexus because the 2016 presidential election certainly exposed we have to look inward a bit to address domestic issues here in the United States, income inequality, et cetera. But we also can't retreat from the world. The world is a better place with American engagement and American leadership. So I am an optimist. I actually, one of the benefits of this job being a member of Congress is we get to meet interesting people. And Bill Gates is an interesting person. And he gave us a book called Factfulness that, there's fear and anxiety around the world, but if we actually look at the facts, the world is a better place today than it has ever been. We have challenges, and we should face those challenges head first. We should face those challenges with our values. Now, let's shift a little bit to the Indo-Pacific region. I've had the honor of being a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, now about to start my 8th year on the committee, and I think this time next week I will assume the chairmanship of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. And assuming my peers give me that privilege tomorrow. But I think that'll happen. And I've had the pleasure to travel to India and to the region with Chairman Royce. The relationship between the United States and India can be a defining relationship. And I know you'll hear from Ambassador Wells shortly to talk about that. But it has to be intentional. It has to be built on values. And when we think about the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy, we have to build off of those shared values as we move forward. Some of that will be our deciding what our foreign policy doctrine is with relationship to the rest of the world. But some of that will also be the Indians deciding what their foreign policy doctrine will be. And it's not a given. I am a strong advocate of the USIndia relationship and want to see India take its place at the table with the leading nations in the world, with those world leaders. I know in the Foreign Affairs Committee we've advocated and introduced legislation to, India ought to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council and so forth, but with that comes responsibilities as well. And India has to decide if it wants to be that world leader or, as it moves from a developing nation to developed nation to a leading nation. And, it's my hope, given the importance of our relationship, that it does realize that place at the table. And that's my hope when we have the 2x2 dialogue next week. And India's strength, as I've said in recent days and recent months, is as a secular democracy. If you look at the founding of the nation, it's founded on values of being a secular democracy, and that holding on to that identity is incredibly important. And the strength of any democracy is protecting the rights of minority groups. And these will be interesting conversations over the next week or so, but I think incredibly important conversations if we want to keep the partnership, the relationship moving in the right trajectory. And I really do think India can have a defining role in the future of where we head in the 21st century. Let me just broaden a little bit to talk about kind of the Indo-Pacific, and then we'll have a conversation. And when I think about the Indo-Pacific region and the Asia-Pacific region, I think President Obama was headed in the right direction. I do think, whereas the 20th century was defined by the transatlantic relationship, I think the 21st century will be defined by the trans-Pacific relationship. And it's not a given what this looks like. We do see competitor nations like China and so forth rising. But if we just choose to look at China through an adversarial lens, then we potentially miss the opportunity of, we are going to be competitors with China, but is there an opportunity to have a more collaborative relationship where both countries rise and thrive? When we look at the other countries in the region, and think about where we move forward, one of as someone who supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of my big concerns, and I think a strategic bad decision, was pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I think we make a mistake when we just think of trade deals through the lens of global commerce, because we've used trade and commerce and economic development as a tool of strategy as well, a tool to create democracies and vibrancies and lasting relationships. And I do hope either in the current administration or in a future administration, we are able to revive that global interconnectedness, because I do think it is a tool that is incredibly strategic for us in terms of creating peace, creating lasting democracies, and enduring relationships. So I'll stop with that, and let's have a conversation.
Thank you, Congressman. So it's a great honor to have you here. Congratulations. We hope that we can celebrate officially very soon the new role that you'll be playing. I joked with Congressman outside that it was very kind of him to make the time, but probably easy given that there's not much happening in Congress these days, right?
It's a little boring.
A little boring these days. But he's got a tight schedule, and we probably needs to get back to the Hill, and so we just have about 10 minutes with him. So I've got three questions for you, building on both the big ideas in President Eisenhower's speech, but really on the issues that you hit on. Let's start with the Indo-Pacific. So for the United States and India to achieve a shared partnership, a genuine partnership that secures peace, right, through the Indo-Pacific, what needs to get done on both sides from your perspective?
I think a partnership built on mutual respect and mutual understanding, which starts with the shared, which are democratic values. But as I stated in my remarks, India's strength has been as a secular democracy, and that strength really has been built on protecting the rights of minorities. And in this case, it's not lost on anyone in this room some of the tensions happening in India. I would like us to move past a conversation on Kashmir to a conversation on trade, a conversation on defense-to-defense spaces. But right now, most of my conversations with colleagues are, well, can you tell me what's happening in Kashmir? That becomes a barrier to all the other things that we truly could accomplish in a partnership.
So one of the things I think in these conversations is often a sense that we keep going back to the shared values. Right. And I would argue that on both sides, those values are being threatened. It's not just we can look at Kashmir, we can look at the Citizenship Amendment Bill, but of course from India, you look at the United States right now, and you don't necessarily see a bastion of democracy and freedom in the same way that we're used to seeing. So at what point do you think we should start worrying that the divergence of values both across the two countries, but maybe in each country from their founding documents, begins to threaten the relationship as a whole?
So, and it's not isolated to India and the United States.
No.
You certainly see kind of the autocracy, fomenting in many countries around the world. I think going back to President Eisenhower, this is also where the people-to-people relationship has to step up, and the parliamentarian to congressional relationship. And that's one that we certainly have tried to build, because members of Congress are, I'm now serving under my second president, and I likely will serve under future presidents, can create that enduring bond that doesn't shift from one administration to the next, but can actually build towards the future. We have to be intentional here, because it's not a given what the 21st century looks like. We had breakfast with Secretary Albright this morning, so it's a good foreign policy day for someone who is immersed in this. We should ask ourselves, what is our 21st century foreign policy doctrine from the United States perspective? And I think, post World War II, during the Cold War, we had a doctrine that really wasn't a Democratic doctrine or a Republican doctrine. I don't think we have those guiding principles right now that are lasting and that can project out for the next 6 years, as your grandfather projected out. I think India then has to ask that question of what it wants to be as well. It had guiding principles that Prime Minister Nehru and Gandhi laid out that I believe served India very, very well as a complicated nation. But what is that next doctrine? And those are going to require tough conversations. But again, this should be a partnership built on mutual respect. Mm-hmm. I also, this probably wouldn't be popular in India, but the United States as the world leader in the last 70 years, we take on a lot of criticism and so forth, and we don't react to it. We don't take it personally. And some of that criticism's rightfully deserved. But as India moves to sit at the table, it is going to come under criticism, and it can't be so sensitive to external criticism. It has to allow us to raise questions, raise issues, and that is what leading nations do, that your sense of self is not so fragile. And if India is to take that place, it can't have a fragile ego.
I think that's a great point. The people-to-people partnership, President Eisenhower in that last line says, the future, peace will be through people talking to people. So much of that we have thought about in the context of immigration. And of course, the Indian American experience that, generations of Indian Americans or Indians who came to America made lives. We have so many in this room, including yourself and Ambassador Verma, whose contributions to this country, I think, are immense. And yet the consensus of immigration as being a strength for the United States seems to be under threat today in a way that I can't remember. Sitting on the Hill, what are the conversations? What should we be expecting?
Conversations behind closed doors within both, President Trump occupies an unusual place to do it. I think he came to the presidency because he understood domestic challenges that we face in the United States. And I think it would be remiss for those of us in Congress, Democrats and Republicans, not to understand those domestic challenges. They're very real. A lot of people feel as though they're left behind. You see geographic segregation. Where I think President Trump has taken that, though, is for those grievances that many Americans feel, he's then said they're to blame for your challenge, or they're to blame for your challenge. And he's pointed those externally. And if we look at the strength of the United States as well as the difficulty of the United States, is we are a nation of immigrants, one generation after another. My parents came in the 1950s. seeking that freedom, that opportunity. That is our core strength. It's this quilt, this fabric that's woven together of different cultures, different religions, but it allows us to reinvent ourselves over and over again. Think about the Indian American diaspora. It is now the wealthiest diaspora in America. It's the most educated diaspora in America, and it's about 1% of the population. That happened in one generation. That story can be told by the Jewish American diaspora, by many diasporas. So if we are to wall ourselves off to the rest of the world, we lose the core strength that has allowed us to thrive. Because we should want the best and brightest to come here. If just by its very nature, the folks that immigrate here, if I think about my parents and their story, they came from nothing, from small villages in India, and they thrived. Even if you think about the folks that are now coming up from Central America, what they have to do, the resiliency to make that trek all the way up here, suggests that you are getting the best and the brightest, the most resilient individuals. That's something we should welcome, not close off. Because if you also look at, I travel a lot, and when I go to some of the Indo-Pacific nations, Japan, Korea, China, you see a very homogeneous population. You see linear thinking. That isn't the United States, and yes, it creates challenges for us, but it creates huge opportunities for us, and it's been a formula that's been successful. So I think this is a blip on the radar screen, but I think it is up to members of Congress to rise up and come up with comprehensive immigration reform, address these challenges, and I'm an optimist. I think it will happen. President Trump would take this as a compliment. He's been very disruptive. Well, let's take that disruption as an opportunity to not just rebuild what we had before, but to rethink what will serve us well, what policies, what kind of foreign policy, what kind of development tools will serve us well in the 21st century, what kind of immigration policy. So I'm an optimist, and the world will be a better place.
I think to do your job, you better be an optimist. So applaud you for doing it. As everyone I'm sure knows, Congressman Bera is now the longest serving Indian American in Congress. We hope and expect that this is the start of, I think, a very long and distinguished career in public service. I will point out that as an Indian, the fact that you first had to be a doctor before becoming a representative fulfills a lot of stereotypes about us and puts a lot of pressure on the rest of us, but well done. Thank you. We're looking forward. We welcome you back to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you.
Anytime you have some time. For our next panel, while I still have the Congressman, let me ask Dr. Kurt Campbell to come on. We're just going to keep this train rolling. Dr. Campbell is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Asia Group. He served most recently as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, where he's widely credited with helping design and lay the foundations for the pivot to Asia, so very much fulfilling, again, the themes that President Eisenhower was anticipating 60 years ago. For his service in government, Secretary Clinton honored him with the Distinguished Service Award, the nation's highest diplomatic honor. And so it's a great honor to ask Dr. Kurt Campbell to join us on stage. They'll be coming from the green room in a second, maybe refill your coffee, and we'll be ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ami.
We good? Rich?
Ladies and gentlemen, could you please take your seats? Ladies and gentlemen, can you please take your seats? The next panel is about to begin. Please take your seats. If we could ask everyone to please take their seats, the next panel is about to begin.
Thank you very much. Friends, can I bring you back to order? And again, thank you for joining us today at the Atlantic Council. And I want to pay respects to Ambassador Verma for putting this wonderful group together. It's been fascinating so far. We've had a wonderful historical retrospective exploring this important speech and his visit to India. We're going to take you into the present now with a panel that's going to explore where the Indo-Pacific is, India's role in it, and what lessons that we can take from 60 years ago as we head into an incredibly dynamic period today. I'm thrilled to have just a terrific panel, three wonderful people, all who are well known to you. I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce. I think you all know Admiral Richardson just left service recently. He was the 31st Chief of Naval Operations, long-term submariner, wonderful person, played a critical role in U.S. thinking about the Indo-Pacific concept. I've known him for many years. He can tell you a lot of sea stories about Asia, and we look forward to his comments. Ashley, a dear friend to my immediate left, if you had to choose one person who is the father of the Indo-Pacific concept, a great strategist, one who has helped us think about the important role that India is playing strategically in the Asia-Pacific, and Alyssa Ayers, who is currently serving as a senior fellow on the Council on Foreign Relations. I love her book. If we had to talk about a couple of different books, I love Bill's book. I think any of you are looking for a good Christmas book, that's the one to get about Eisenhower. If you think Our Time is Crazy, the 1950s can match that. I urge you to go out and get it. You can get it delivered tomorrow because I just ordered it. Alyssa's book I would also recommend, Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World. So wonderful panel. Very grateful for all three of them joining us today. So Adam, I'm going to begin with you. So Rich began by talking about some of the symmetries between the late 1950s and today. If you think about that, that was really the dawn of the Asian miracle. Really dramatic exports begin in this period, growing economies in Japan and Northeast Asia, India awakening, thinking about the world. Bring us 60 years into the future. You just got off active duty. One of your most important roles, both here in Washington, but in your other assignments, was thinking about the Asia-Pacific region. As you look at it, what are the great opportunities and challenges as we go forward?
Well, I think first, let me just say what a delight it is to be back on the panel with you. Ambassador Verma, thank you very much for inviting me here. And most of what I know, I learned from the people on my left and right during my time as CNO. And so I'm really outclassed here, but everybody's so nice about it that it makes it pleasant. One of the most important relationships that we have is our relationship with India in the Indo-Pacific. I just had a chance to talk to the current Chief of Naval Operations, confirmed that we are full speed ahead in making sure that that relationship remains on a trajectory that continues to strengthen this relationship. I think if you fast forward from the 50s to today, you would see in many ways the fulfillment of a dream. The economic growth, the democratic growth, the diplomatic growth of that entire region, with just economies exploding literally under the framework and the rule set that was put in place at the end of World War II, and has really allowed so many of the nations there to flourish. I think your book is so perfectly titled because I think that India sees this as a time where they are really coming into their own and are ready to step forward and take a much more of a leadership role there in that region, not only to secure themselves domestically, but to provide, be an exporter of regional security. And we certainly got that sense in the military to military, Navy to Navy relationship that we built, which was very strong to begin with and got much stronger. Really leveraging off of the elements that we have in common: democratic nations, maritime nations, those sorts of fundamental tenets of national security, national power. In terms of challenges, I think China is the great newcomer on the scene, if you will, and I'd be interested to see what my fellow panelists think about the nature of India's response to the Chinese growth into that region, particularly their maritime presence, now through the Strait of Malacca into the Indian Ocean and across. As you think about that Belt and Road Initiative manifesting itself, I think that would be the one challenge that we've got to get right, this India-China relationship, and then extending out to Japan, the United States, and other major players.
Admiral, that's a nice segue. So, Ashley, one of the things that you've written eloquently about is that, of course, the important relationship of the 21st century is between the United States and China, but perhaps the dominant relationship, the one that we really have to keep our eyes on, is the relationship between India and China. Give us your insights about how's that fixed now and how do you expect it to trend over time?
Well, thank you, Kurt. Let me start by thanking Admiral Richardson and Alyssa for being with me on this panel, and of course, thank you to Rich for doing this. One has to see India's role in the Indo-Pacific in the larger context of the concurrent rise of China and India, and the gradual shift in power from what was the old Anglo-Saxon space to the Asian space. So the Indians genuinely believe that their time has come, but it is that coming is occurring in a context where there is a large, almost a superpower state on their doorsteps for the first time in their 5,000-year-old history. This has never been true in Indian history before, where they've had to deal with a major power with whom they have a rivalrous relationship so close to their borders. And so the challenge for India is, how do they preserve the opportunities for cooperation with China? Because they don't want to risk a war. They don't want to risk manic competition that could undermine their desire for long-term economic growth, with the realities that competition between these two countries is not going to go away. And so India has to walk a tightrope between protecting its interests in the context of competition with China, while also preserving whatever opportunities there are for cooperation. And the United States looms very large in the context of the calculus. And increasingly now, Pacific Asia, because the Indians have come to the recognition that they will not be able to deal with the China challenge unilaterally or alone. And so the partnership with the United States, and the partnership particularly with other Asian powers like Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, even Australia, will become critical to this calculus. So we are actually at the early stages of watching the evolution of India's gradual integration into the Indo-Pacific. It's a story whose last chapter has not been written, but we have to watch this space.
I want to just ask you, before going to you, Alyssa, just one last thing on that, Ashley. I was struck in multilateral meetings that I had with Indian friends just a few years ago that as much as we tried to talk to them and engage them on Pacific and Asian-related issues, it was not a natural process. They were still more comfortable in a regional setting that really is not about the dynamism of East Asia, but much more about some of these intractable problems of the South Asia. Is that going to change over time in your view?
It is going to change over time for sure, and you begin to see India already engaging with the broader Indo-Pacific space at the geopolitical level, at the military level. But India's biggest weakness in this engagement is its economic trajectory. India is still not an outward-looking nation economically, whereas the rest of Pacific Asia is essentially dominated by outward-looking economies. So in addition to all the other contradictions that I identified in the Sino-Indian space, India has to cope with the reality that it is not economically integrated with Asia in a way that is necessary for its long-term success. And yet it seeks to be partners with essentially other countries that want to be even more deeply involved with India, not just geopolitically, but economically. And so until India makes the strategic decisions at home with respect to accelerating economic openness, it's going to be handicapped with respect to its alliance building strategies beyond the subcontinent.
Great. Alyssa, thank you. I just want folks to know how much we appreciate Alyssa joining us today. She's right after this getting on a train to head to India for important sessions to really discuss India's role in the world. And I'd also like to point out that an enormous tree fell near her house and she wasn't able to get there. And you notice how well run this conference is. Rich sent part of our team in the Asia group with chainsaws. They cut the tree. This is a true story. Cut the tree, and she's here. So great that you're able to join us.
Thank you, Rich.
So thanks, Rich, for that. So Alyssa, just help us. So your book really describes how India is starting to think about the world. Maybe for this group, help us understand. India's always had a complex relationship with the United States, complex views about the United States. How are those views evolving?
Well, I think Ashley put this exactly right, that India sees the United States as a power that can be uniquely helpful to supporting India realize its own ambitions in the world. So we are playing a helpful role to India's ambitions, India's own ambitions. And sometimes we have some challenges because India's ambitions are not always the same as what the United States would like to see India do. We have some geographic differences, even on the definition of what constitutes the Indo-Pacific region. You hear this all the time, that the United States is far more interested in partnering or seeking Indian partnership across the more Pacific Ocean side of this large space. And India would like to see a deeper engagement and cooperation with more attention to the Indian Ocean part of this space. But India does seek to increase its capacity. You see the number of exercises with the United States continues to increase very successfully. The defense, the strategic relationship between India and the United States, I would say, is probably the biggest success story bilaterally of the last decade. It really has continued to gain ground. We now have trilateral, quadrilateral consultations, strategic consultations. This is a big deal. You couldn't have imagined it 25 years ago. But what does India seek in this region? It seeks primacy in the Indian Ocean. It seeks to be its region's major power. That is where we can play a role helping India with its capacity. I'd just like to note one thing that Ashley referred to is the economic undergirding of this rise in this story. There was a recent news report, I think it was just last week, if I'm not mistaken, about the Navy seeing a drop in its budget. To the extent that India doesn't attain those high rates of economic growth that it needs to power its modernization and its ability to build this blue water navy, it's going to fall short of its own ambitions in trying to attain and preserve that primacy that it seeks in the region.
Alyssa, that's a nice segue. Admiral, so in your capacity, you dealt primarily with the Indian Navy. Right. But I'd be curious bureaucratically, of course there's no bureaucratic politics in our military organizations, but as you look at India, do you discern subtle competitions about who wants to work more with the United States, what the particular focus are in terms of investments, and what does that mean for the trajectory of the U.S.-India relationship?
Well, just to leverage off of what Alyssa said, there has been, I think, overall tremendous progress made. And it's not just, it's not only exercises, which have grown more in number, but also in complexity. The inclusion of the Japanese in the Malabar exercise, which is a huge undertaking. We participated with a carrier strike group and a nuclear submarine just recently. So those types of exercises are meaningful, but even perhaps more meaningful, we've got technological agreements now in the defense sector. sort of two giant bureaucracies meeting each other, something will happen that's good. But with the aircraft carrier and aircraft production, consistent with the Made in India concept there in terms of the economic dimension. There's also been important communication and information sharing agreements, logistics agreements, and so these are agreements that have been a long time coming. We've been working hard to achieve them and have recently done so. With respect to just the role of the Indian Navy, my understanding is that and I think we've had a couple of conversations in terms of the hierarchy of the services. It wouldn't break in the top half right now, which is ironic given kind of their ambitions to grow into that Indian Ocean region. I think something's going to have to change there. I think they've got some really great strategic thinkers in their Navy leadership, and so that would be a natural growth area for them as well. And tremendous competition between the services, and so this is just not helpful to them in terms of realizing that ambition to become a regional leader. So I think they've got to just kind of think a little bit more just in the defense sector alone as a team there.
Interesting. So Ashley, this conference that is really posited on the beginning of presidential engagement with India, and I love the fact that this was the first use of the modern Air Force One, this first trip to India. So, you associate with various presidents different periods of engagement with India, the Galbraith period with Kennedy, and the interesting kind of relationships that Clinton had in the 1990s. Obviously, your role with President Bush, and then more recently. I know it's early. We're talking with Susan Eisenhower, and it's often hard to make judgments when we're either so close or right in the midst of engagements. But give us a sense, carefully, of how you think the Indian government is engaging President Trump and his team.
It's a challenging time for this relationship to flourish. But I think it's a tribute to the Prime Minister that he has broken the code. And that's not always easy to do. But he's broken the code in terms of making time to engage the president personally and directly. Now, I think that is necessary, but over the long arc, it is still insufficient. Because unless the United States recovers from its amnesia about why the world is important to our interests, Indian investments in President Trump will not be sufficient to sustain the partnership in a way that we have for the last 20 years. So I think leadership engagement is critical, but it will not carry us over the threshold. And I'm still waiting for the time when we will begin to focus more clearly on our own responsibilities to maintaining an international system that is essentially favorable to the enlargement of a liberal order. Because if we cannot sustain that investment, then the world in which India operates is going to be much more hostile to India's own interests, not to mention the US-India relationship. So again, this is something whose end process we haven't quite yet seen.
Interesting. I will say, one of the things I hear in Northeast Asia and also in India is that President Trump has invested an enormous amount of time in some of these personal relationships. And I hope that is something that we will take going forward in any circumstances. Alyssa, I thought it might be useful to tell the group a little bit. So in your engagement in India, India's decided to host a gathering that really signifies its interest in certain kinds of multilateral engagement. I thought they'd be interested, perhaps as a final segue into our next session, about what you're about to do in the next couple of days.
Sure. Well, in addition to deepening India's engagement with the United States in conversations about East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, our exercises, our defense partnership, and our strategic conversations, from within the State Department. By the way, the 2+2 coming up, we'll see what happens with that. We're now seeing from India more of a push to become a platform, a convening country for conversations about the strategic future of the Indo-Pacific region. So this weekend, RIS will be convening a conference called the Delhi Dialogue, and it's ministerial level now, and they're bringing in people from East Asia, Southeast Asia, the United States, to talk about the Indo-Pacific, emerging architectures, challenges, what does this all mean? So I think this is kind of a new role now. I mean, it's not new yesterday, but we're seeing this as an emerging strategic leadership role on the world stage where India is saying, we want to host, we want to drive discussion on what it means to have this region, who should be engaged, how should we engage, what are the priorities, are these military strategic dominant priorities, do economic concerns matter in this landscape, where does the geography begin and end? I think India is interested now in playing a role driving all those questions.
Great, thanks, Liz. All right, we're in our lightning round. I'm getting notes about how many seconds I have left. So we're going to ask one last question and just get your sense, just starting with this, Admiral. So if you had to just make just a quick assessment. So over the next 5 years, you get three options. The U.S.-India relationship is going to trend dramatically upward. We're going to see real improvements across the board, economic, military, people to people. Steady she goes, second option. Or third, we're going to start to see some real issues on trade and differences around Iran and Russia. You have those three choices, right? Really up, steady she goes, or problems on the horizon.
Yeah,
Which do you choose?
I'm between A and B. You know, I think that there's tremendous opportunity here. It'll depend on how we play those cards and all of that. But, you know, I would hope that we'd achieve some better than steady as she goes progress.
Where are you, Ashley?
Same place that Admiral Richardson is for two reasons. One, it's not clear what India's own trajectory will be over the next 5 years, and that'll be a critical variable both on the economic side as well as its own political evolution. And it's also not clear where we will be over the next 5 years, depending on what happens on elections next year and so on and so forth. So the intersection of these two variables will really determine the trajectory of this bilateral relationship.
Alyssa, you have the second to last word.
I endorse this view. I also would like to note that I continue to worry about the possibility that we'll all wake up one day and there will be a new tweet about new tariffs or something that will create more speed bumps. There is a surprise factor that nobody quite knows how to evaluate. We do have a very bumpy economic dialogue with India. It's taking years now to reach what appears to be a kind of modest agreement on, as far as the press accounts tell it, something like stents and walnuts. I mean, it's a very modest set of products in this conversation, and it is taking a very long time. But I do think that suggests that there's the possibility for speed bumps there. But I have been impressed with the degree to which the strategic and defense relationship continues to expand.
Right, and the correct answer, it's all three. It's going to trend dramatically forward, steady she goes, and huge problems. We're going to have walnuts for lunch, and but first we're going to hear from the ambassador, the assistant secretary. Please join me in thanking a wonderful panel today.
Yeah. Let me slide right behind you. Well, yeah. This looks heavy. Yeah. So folks, we're going to do a quick transition here while they get set up. We're in the home stretch, but let me take the opportunity to introduce our next speaker. Ambassador Alice Wells assumed her duties as Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia in 2017. She previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to Jordan. She's been a senior advisor in the Near East Bureau, a special assistant to the President for Russia and Central Asia in the White House, executive assistant to Secretary of State Clinton. And we first met when you were working for Undersecretary of State Bill Burns for political affairs. She served in the embassy in Moscow in so many different posts, but let me just say personally what a thrill it's been and an honor to get to know Ambassador Wells. And she's got really one of the hardest jobs in the State Department. It's a difficult and complicated region with a lot of hope, a lot of promise, but also a lot of challenges. And she handles the job with such skill, with such expertise, with such openness, and always looking to engage with different people, always willing to hear different ideas, and really, you know, the State Department has really shined over the last few weeks and months in particular, but when we get to know, you know, the backbone of the department and just the hard work that you and your team do each day, it's a great honor for you to be here with us today, and we're just really thrilled. So thank you, Ambassador Wells. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, and I've had the privilege to learn about India really at the knees of Ashley and Rich Verma and others in this room, and so it's a privilege to speak here today, and I want to thank you for co-hosting the event and to have so many people who are fans and friends of the US-India partnership, and a special thanks, of course, to Susan Eisenhower, President of the Eisenhower Group, who's done tremendous work in supporting this relationship. I would say, Rich, many of the accomplishments with India are in no small part due to his own personal efforts. And so I think we need to stop and reflect again on what a bipartisan project India has been and continues to be. And it's great to take stock of the India relationship in light of President Eisenhower's historic visit in 1959, the first ever by a sitting American president, because our relationship has come so far since then. I appreciated how Eisenhower stated before India's parliament that the welfare of America is bound up with the welfare of India, and that is certainly so true today, and it captures, I think, our common heritage as democracies and how we need to work together and move past what were the Cold War non-aligned movement complexities. Today, the US-India relationship would scarcely be recognizable to Eisenhower's contemporaries. You know, over the past 2 decades, under 4 presidents, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat, we have built a stronger US-India relationship that helps uphold international norms, it builds prosperity, it helps to counter terrorism and advances our shared interests in Asia and beyond, and that's really quite remarkable. And I think in Delhi there's been a growing consensus that no relationship matters more when it comes to advancing India's economic and security interests as well as its global aspirations. Now, the 2+2 dialogue has become the principal mechanism under the Trump administration for translating this strategic convergence into tangible outcomes. And it's really contributed to a quiet sea change in recent years in how we do things with India. And the outcomes, I think, are finally matching the rhetoric. And so in advance of next week's visit by Defense Minister Singh and Minister Jaishankar, I wanted to focus just briefly on 3 areas: interoperability, regional cooperation, and people-to-people ties, as well as to acknowledge some of the challenges. First, on interoperability. When people hear interoperability, they think military cooperation. And certainly we've reached many milestones recently in this area with India, whether it's the group sail in the South China Sea, secure hotlines, the Secure Communications Agreement, or COMCASA, which has greatly enhanced our naval cooperation, or whether it's the inaugural tri-service exercise that was held last month. And this service-to-service interoperability is going to continue to grow as we work to conclude the outstanding defense-enabling agreements. And for example, the Industrial Security Agreement will allow for new avenues of collaboration between our private sectors on defense research and co-development. And I think I was in Delhi when Ashley was trying to push that rock up the hill on these enabling agreements, and almost 20 years later, we're here, we've done it, and we're going to achieve a new level of interoperability. But it's also on the diplomatic side that we have this interoperability. There's a new comfort level between our diplomats and our development experts when it comes to working together, whether it's in the Quad, whether it's on maritime issues, on joint projects like the MCC-supported Nepal-India power line, or even in routine consultations in capitals around the world. My colleague from OSD, Randy Shriver, and I co-lead both the Maritime Security Dialogue as well as what I call the mini 2+2 dialogue. And these are invaluable mechanisms for bringing together civilians and military counterparts in both governments. I would say the second area, regional cooperation, what I would highlight is the Quad. The formation of the Quad about 2.5 years ago, which consists of the US, India, Japan, and Australia, and met for the first time at the ministerial level on the margins of the UN General Assembly, is an important step forward in aligning like-minded powers behind the principle of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And just, I think a few weeks ago, India hosted a successful counterterrorism tabletop exercise among Quad partners. Our Quad cyber experts are meeting this week to discuss shared challenges in cyberspace, including cybercrime and 5G. And as I like to say, when I entered the Foreign Service, the Quad was the US, UK, France, and Germany. Today the Quad is something very different, reflecting the new world realities that we confront. We've also seen India use its engagements with the United States to expand its strategic horizons. So maritime security is just one example. Following the conclusion of the US-India Logistics Agreement in 2016, we saw India conclude similar agreements with a number of close partners. As we grow our naval cooperation, we're seeing India broaden its maritime footprint with partners, including through the launching of an Indian Fusion Center. And our increased consultations on regional issues will be a central component of the upcoming 2+2, where we envision in-depth discussions on a range of pressing issues, whether it's Afghanistan, terrorism, regional connectivity, and the Indo-Pacific. Third, on people to people, which is traditionally the very strong pillar in our relationship, I think the Howdy Modi event in Texas captured in a powerful way the close rapport between the President and Prime Minister, as well as the bonds between our citizens. And students are a great example of this story. We have over 200,000 Indians coming to study in the United States, a record number. They contribute more than $7 billion to the US economy. At the same time, our scientists are working together more closely than ever, including on space situational awareness, human spaceflight, and joint research. Scientists from NASA and ISRO are in the advanced stages of building the NISAR Earth observation satellite, which will be one of the most cutting edge of its type. And at the 2+2, we seek to elevate our partnership even further. We're going to increase cooperation on water management, disaster relief, science and technology, peacekeeping, judicial cooperation, and people-to-people exchanges, including between innovators and parliamentarians. So please stay tuned. I don't want to diminish the challenges that we have in the relationship. We continue to closely monitor the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, where we look to the government to take additional steps to release detainees and restore political and economic normalcy that will help to ease local tensions. No one doubts that India faces a tough security situation given the terror groups that operate across the border, but Kashmiris are entitled to their full rights under the Indian Constitution, which enshrines the respect for religious freedom of all Indians. I know firsthand the degree to which issues like Kashmir and the citizenship bill have garnered attention on the Hill. I'm headed to the Hill this afternoon for a closed-door briefing. And as a fellow democracy, we want to ensure that one of the pillars underpinning our partnership, our common democratic values, remains strong. Trade negotiations, as was discussed between the Ministry of Commerce and Industry and USTR, are ongoing. The talks are in a better place. They take much longer than we would like. The deal will be modest, but hopefully a stepping stone to more ambitious trade liberalization. We're getting close to finalizing it, but this is something we really see India needing to demonstrate, not just to the United States, but to the international community, its willingness to become a part of that global supply chain. This could, we hope, also be a first step towards resolving larger market access issues, including in sectors affected by India's data localization and e-commerce policies. Our goal remains to continue expanding trade and investment in a way that's fair, balanced, and reciprocal. And I would note, bilateral trade grew to $142 billion. We're doing well in increasing the amount of trade, with the deficit decreasing largely due to strategic investments by India in energy imports. But the message I want to leave with you is that there are challenges, but we're working together to overcome them in ways that would have seemed impossible in the past. And certainly in the year 2000, when I first served in India, when Ashley Tellis was there, we are moving from the era of ambitions to the era of achievements. Media commentators and strategic pundits, I think on occasion, paint a gloomy picture, whether it's on H-1B or trade, Iran, sanctions. But I think if you look back over the Trump administration, we've been able to manage these differences quite effectively and not let them cast a shadow on what is otherwise a very positive track record, which will be highlighted at the 2+2 next week. So let me close by again underscoring the importance of the 2+2 and building out this partnership. Of course, I'm saying this both as a bureaucrat, but as somebody who really truly appreciates from my own personal perspective of having worked on this relationship for almost 20 years, just how much we have achieved and how much the geopolitical challenges that both India and the United States face, compel this level of cooperation between our two countries. Thank you. And Rich, where are you?
Great. Ambassador, thank you so much. One thing you mentioned was all the people who have come before us, actually, and who have worked on this relationship. And one person I wanted to recognize who's here, Congressman Bera recognized him, but someone who really took the Congress to a new place, Congressman Ed Royce, and I as the chairman of the House International Relations Committee, we appreciate his leadership. So let me just jump into it and do kind of go through the list of issues, if that's okay. You mentioned the trade talks, and I wonder if you could just give us maybe a little, maybe more precise prediction of where you think things are. Is this a 2019 deal to be closed, or is this going to happen next year, or we don't know yet?
I don't have a crystal ball, and USTR would knock it off the table if I did have one. So I don't want to get in the way of what are, though, productive conversations. And so there is intense interaction between USTR and India. I think there's a high expectation based on the conversations between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi that a deal will be finished and that it will serve as a stepping stone for what need to be broader conversations. We spent a lot of time talking to private sector who are very focused on emerging legislation in India on data localization, privacy, e-commerce. These are issues that we're all grappling with, but I have to say in general we're concerned about the growing data protectionism that we see worldwide, based on the fact that the US and India have demonstrated so phenomenally what you can accomplish when you have free flows of data. I think we estimate about 8% of India's GDP can be attributed to IT companies that rely on this free flow of data, that we should be able to, I think, propel forward a data relationship that sets a high standard for the free flow.
So the economic issues seem to be having a bigger impact in the relationship, and maybe it's been like that for since 1947 or really the last few decades. But the last 2 or 3 years, we seem to have been kind of stuck in some of the trade issues. And I just from a kind of how the U.S. government engages with India, do you see a divide, between the foreign policy and defense community, and then the trade and economics community? So next week we'll have the 2+2, but it's almost happening somewhat disconnected from some of the more harder issues that are happening on this trade front. How do we fix that seam if in fact there is one?
I don't think there is the seam. I heard those concerns when I started because we separated out the 2+2 dialogue from the trade dialogue. And nobody can doubt under the Trump administration that trade is strategic. I mean, this is the foremost issue for President Trump, having fair reciprocal trade. And so it very much is the backdrop to the 2+2 conversation. It's an issue that Secretary Pompeo himself engages on. But it also goes to the ambitions of the partnership. How can India play the role that it wants to play, being an important part of the global supply chain, if it doesn't grapple with the tariff and non-tariff barriers that make don't make that possible. When I speak to major companies and they talk about how they assess, everyone's excited about India and wants to be in India and part of what's going to happen in India. But it shouldn't just be for producing for the domestic market. If India wants to be an exporter, if India wants to use trade to drive job production and to address some of the economic challenges it's currently facing, it needs to be competitive in its exports, which many companies say right now it's not because of the tariff barriers. So this is not just a US-India trade issue. It goes to the very ambitions of what India wants to achieve and what we want to achieve with India.
Got it. Let me take a step back and talk about the broader region for a second as articulated in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, which is this has been something that's been worked on for years. We had the joint strategic vision with India. Now we have this much broader Indo-Pacific strategy that Admiral and so many others have worked on. The skeptics or critics would say this is just about China and constraining China. How do you respond to that? How much of this is military? How much of this is economic, diplomatic? Can you just give us a flavor for what the strategy is really about?
Well, the strategy is it's economics, it's governance, it's strategic, military to military, but you have to acknowledge today that the threat to the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific and the broader threat to the post-World War II order has been China's increasing assertiveness, both economically and certainly for India that shares a long border with China, militarily. And so there is a geopolitical, I think, understanding that like-minded countries, most importantly India and the United States, need to be able to stand for the values of free and open, but also it has to be more than rhetoric. How do we address the needs of countries who desperately need infrastructure, who need investment, who want to see the United States and India be active participants in their economy? And so I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is doing that. And you've seen over the last 2 years, what was first the rhetoric of the strategy and the aspirations of the strategy, and now the growth of the supporting programs. And so whether it's the Development Finance Corporation that's being brought into life as we speak, or whether it's the specific infrastructure initiatives to support the ability of countries to assess infrastructure projects and to assess proposals, or whether it's the emphasis on energy and digital connectivity, more money, more resources, more initiatives are now flowing this direction.
So you mentioned there is a threat to the order, and China's rise certainly presents us with that challenge. And again, some of the concern in India has been it's one of we're being used in kind of this great power struggle. And there was a quote from Foreign Minister who's going to be here next week who says, quote, "We are not going to be used in someone else's wedge in a balancing competition." We India are not going to be used as a wedge.
Right.
How do you respond to that?
Well, nobody wants to be a wedge in somebody's geopolitical competition. That's not what we're discussing. We're not talking about a containment strategy or a zero-sum game against another power. What we're talking about is standing for the values that our democracies enshrine, and to stand for the free and open trading system that has benefited all countries, and certainly most of all China. I think India, from the very beginning, recognized, for instance, the Belt and Road strategy for what it was, a geopolitical play to advance China's specific interests, not the development needs of the countries where it was operating. Increasingly, we've seen in places, whether it's Sri Lanka and Maldives in the near neighborhood, or Pakistan or Malaysia or others, what BRI has come to stand for. So again, I don't see this. I see a great deal of commonality in U.S. and India approach.
Let me turn to the defense relationship, and you mentioned it in your remarks, and it really has surged over the last 2 decades, and it's a lot more than just selling stuff. as the Indians say all the time, we do more exercises with the United States than with any other country. They've gotten more complex. We've added additional nations to the exercises. Do you envision a day where the exercises graduate into something more? People have talked about maybe humanitarian and disaster response cooperation, counter-piracy, counter-proliferation. Is there some projection into the future of going from exercises to more burden sharing?
Well, first I want to thank you and for your efforts on Major Defense Partner, because that was a significant step forward in recognizing India's really unique status. It's not an ally, but it is it occupies its own significant and unique status and role in our partnerships. We've already seen the expansion. I mean, look at the sail-by that we did in the South China Seas with Japan and the Philippines. Look at our cooperation as India is trying to fend off what is the constant Chinese harassment of the gas platform off of Vietnam. I think we've worked very closely with India on humanitarian assistance and disaster response. It was actually Indian forces that evacuated Americans from Yemen, at one point, where we've had the interchangeability of helping our citizens out when we have the opportunity. We've trained peacekeepers in Africa, and we're looking to expand that joint, effort to support peacekeeping more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that's happening, and it's the natural outgrowth of an increasingly interoperable U.S. and India armed forces. The other note I would add to that is, last year, at the first 2+2 ministerial, we signed the COMCASA agreement. And that really was a huge step forward in allowing both countries and allowing India to see the benefits of the U.S. system, of what it means to benefit from all of what U.S. systems have to offer. And I think that intensity of cooperation will be further enhanced as we finish the remaining enabling agreements.
Great. So that's a very positive note. Let me turn to human rights a bit, if I can. And I really appreciate your comments and your directness on the Kashmir set of issues. And you did the exact same thing when you testified on Capitol Hill, certainly a different set of subjects. But maybe, instead of talking about Kashmir specifically or the new citizenship registration bill, can there be part of this dialogue next week, for example, a dialogue on human rights and democratic freedoms? And I assume if there is, that the Indian side would want it to be a reciprocal dialogue about maybe how citizens are treated here, or immigration issues, or take your pick. But can we get human rights as part of the discussion?
Human rights is not part of this 2+2 discussion that's taking place next week, although I'm confident issues that touch on Kashmir and threat perceptions also that India sees will obviously be a part of the agenda, but that doesn't mean we don't discuss human rights. We do all the time. And just as we do with every other country in the world, we produce a human rights report. That human rights report is the outcome of many conversations and as well as work with local NGOs and others involved in this field. So, as democracies, I think we recognize that that institutions have their role to play. And as I said in my testimony before Congress, a lot of the legislation or actions that are now attracting attention here in the United States, and certainly are attracting the attention of members of Congress, these are issues that are being debated, hotly in India. And these are issues that are being taken up at the political level. These are issues that are being taken up in the Indian judiciary. And we need to respect that and let those processes play out.
So Congressman Bera was here, and you're headed up to the Hill as well. I mean, the Hill can be a great partner in this relationship, as with civil nuclear cooperation or major defense partner, but they can also, as you just pointed out, raise some questions or concerns. That's their job. How do you see where the Hill attitude is right now on the relationship? Just your own perspective.
There's enormous support and has been for years for the U.S.-India partnership. The caucus is a wonderful partner in trying to drive forward U.S.-India relationships and remove the underbrush to enhance cooperation between our two countries. But I think it's the intensity, the level of concern within Congress over whether it's Kashmir or other actions on the Citizen Amendment Bill that demonstrate again the genuine concern here in the United States over India's trajectory, and the genuine concern that that these kinds of social issues not detract from India's ability to stand for the values and to stand with us in trying to promote again this free and open Indo-Pacific.
You mentioned, final question, you mentioned Howdy Modi, big success. Do you anticipate any other big heads of state meetings coming up? Houston, otherwise? Yeah, right.
It's a rare month when you don't have a cabinet official in India. So I am confident that our high-level exchanges with India are going to continue, but I don't have anything to announce today.
Okay. Well, before you came in, we spent a lot of time talking about President Eisenhower's, not only his remarks, but his focus on diplomacy, the importance of diplomats, people-to-people ties, and what a supporter and how proud he was of the State Department. And just, you're such a terrific representative of the department, and we just want to thank you for everything that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thanks. And I'm going to invite Irfan back up here for we have a special closing, so thank you.
As you think back to 1959 and some of the photographs out there of President Eisenhower and Prime Minister Nehru, you can't help but think that that was a time when giants strode the earth. And what we wanted to do was take a moment to remember another giant, and that's Dr. Steve Cohen, who passed away at the end of October. For those of you who didn't have the pleasure of knowing him, Steve was really the architect of the study of modern South Asia, especially in the realm of security here in the United States. He was a professor at the University of Illinois from 1965 to 1988. He served on the policy planning staff in the State Department, and then since 1988 till his death in 2009, was a fellow and then fellow emeritus at the Brookings Institution. But far more than all of that, I think for many of us was the incredible mentorship and generosity of spirit, not to mention intellectual leadership, that he provided all of us who were coming of age and interested in questions of South Asia. To remember him, we are very fortunate that his son, Peter Cohen, is able to join us. So Peter, our condolences, but also welcome.
Having me today. Is my mic on?
Yep.
Good, thanks. Thank you for having me today. In the speaker profiles, it's the wrong Peter Cohen. That guy's a billionaire. I'm only a millionaire. I'm sorry to disappoint. So I see a lot of familiar faces out there. My dad frequently attended events like this. Sometimes he brought my mom or many of the 6 kids that he has. A few times some of the 10 grandchildren showed up as well. The academic and think tank community is where my father thrived for many, many years. He enjoyed learning and teaching his entire life. Things like this and at home and with people who came over that we met at conferences or students over the years, they all contributed to that, so it was kind of a great thing. In those 50 years, he penned, I think, a dozen books or so, tons of articles, contributed to various books, various meetings, and everything else. With that, I'm going to give you guys sort of 2 anecdotes in reverse order that I think are applicable, with this. So the first one happened about 13 years ago. We were at my parents' house and we had arranged to have my parents babysit, which they frequently did. And the reason I know it's 13 years ago is obviously because we have a 13-year-old. And what happened was Benazir Bhutto, returned to Pakistan and was assassinated. And as you can imagine, my parents' phone, lit up like you wouldn't believe. It rang off the hook, as we could say. He had done a number of interviews and everything else, but had previously scheduled to babysit for us. And we were over and the phone rings and, whoever it is or what have you, and it's CNN calling for my father to come in tomorrow night or that night or whatever. And he says, no, I'm unable to do it. I'm sorry. I can recommend some other folks. To which my wife and I were like sort of surprised, like, that's CNN, what are you doing? And to which he said, well, I promised I'd babysit. So that was kind of more important to him, than that. He was very, very humble. And then the last one, which is kind of interesting, I was somewhere in my 20s, and it occurred to me I'd never asked my father, why did you choose India? It's 1950 something, you're in grad school, you're an undergrad, and you decide I'm going into political science and I'm going to pick a country and I'm going to study it. And he replied, anyone can study Sweden. All the interesting problems are in India. And to which I leave you good news, they're still there. So thank you for honoring my father.
We've managed to stay on schedule, and that's only possible because of the incredible team here at the Atlantic Council, and the Asia group have been running around tirelessly making Rich and me look good. So thank you to all of them. The Atlantic Council has a very particular relationship actually to the event of today. It was founded in 1961, really trying to build on the spirit that animated President Eisenhower's remarks that you heard at the start of today's event, to think about how the Atlantic values, understood as a commitment to openness, to democracy, to collaboration, could provide the basis for a safe, prosperous, peaceful second half of the 20th century. This was, of course, a generation of policymakers and thinkers who had been deeply scarred by World War II and, of course, World War I before that, and, of course, seeing the Cold War coming. The first chairman of the Atlantic Council, which was founded in 1961, was Secretary Christian Herter, who had been Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. The very first offices of the Atlantic Council were in the Grange building, which had been dedicated the previous year by President Eisenhower. And in the first ever Atlantic Council dinner held at the Mayflower in 1963 with President John Kennedy as sort of the chief honoree, also featured for the first joint honorary chairmans, and that were President Hoover, President Truman, and President Eisenhower, right, the three living presidents of the time. And so for us today at the Atlantic Council, it's been a great honor to have this conversation over here. We see us not just at the South Asia Center, but at centers throughout the Council as trying to live the aspirations of people to people saving the world. We are committed to that ideal. We hope many of you will come back. If you have ideas about how we can help you push that agenda forward, we'd love to be your partners. We do have lunch outside, and so I know everyone's busy and there's another meeting to get to, but in the spirit of people to people, we hope you'll stay around a little while, catch up with old friends, make a few new ones. But thank you all for being here today. Thank you very much.